Why do Jehovah's Witnesses have mental problems? Have you ever wondered about this issue? I have. And recently I read a very interesting article by Jerry Bergman, PhD, that brought out some very interesting points that I'd like to share with you. A scientific literature review found that the rate of mental illness among Jehovah's Witnesses is considerably above average. The specific level found in the research varies partly because the extent of research done was on different populations and time periods. The major factors identified as either helpful or harmful to witness mental health were discussed. Although persons with emotional problems tended to join the witnesses, the Watchtower teachings and its subculture clearly adversely affected the mental health of those involved. The official Watchtower attitude on mental illness was also examined, as were the common beliefs about the problem among witnesses. The history of the Watchtower reveals the sources of mental problems. Jehovah's Witnesses were organized in the late 1800s by Charles Taze Russell, a Second Adventist disappointed in the failed prophecies of his fellow religionists. He soon reinterpreted these prophecies and set his own new dates. He first taught the time of the end started in 1798. He later changed it to 1799. He also taught that Christ had returned invisibly in 1878. He later changed that to 1874. And he taught that a new world wherein the righteous would dwell forever on a paradise earth would begin in 1914. With his father's fortune, Russell preached tirelessly, yet when he died only a small band of followers existed as a result of all his efforts. The second president, a lawyer named Rutherford, used his law background to create one confrontation after another with the state and almost everyone else, including business, medicine, and even religion. Soon Jehovah's Witnesses became infamous throughout the world for their legal clashes, which often involved violence. A fighter, with no small legal skills, Rutherford recruited several other attorneys, and the Watchtower soon had themselves positioned as martyrs. The small band of devoted yet some would say fanatical followers. They achieved something that no amount of money could buy: name recognition. And, at least in the legal profession, an admiration for their legal success and tenacity. The third president, N.H. Knorr, ruled from the 1950s to the 1970s. He toned down their behavior and worked tirelessly to modify their public image from fanatics to quiet, determined Christians, fearlessly going about their work preaching the good news of the Watchtower's kingdom, pushing numerical growth to the exclusion of almost everything else, including the health of individual witnesses. His policies paid off. Except for the 1975 fiasco, growth has usually been steady. 1975 was their third major prediction for Armageddon, the other two were 1914 and 1925, which caused upward of 1 million people to eventually leave the sect. They have carefully cultivated a public image of a God-fearing devoted people, determined to ferret out God's truth from the scriptures and live their lives fully according to them. Behind this facade lies a nightmare which resulted in a rash of mental illness and social problems considerably higher than that found in virtually every American religion. The reasons for the Watchtower's tragedy are complex and can only briefly be explored in this short video. First off, we will look at the scientific research, especially since the 1975 date failed, which was predicted to usher in God's kingdom on earth. The numerous problems in the Watchtower congregations have received much mass media and scholarly attention. Most intensively studied problems include disfellowshipping, doctrinal disputes, and their recurring prophetic speculation failures. Witnesses' mental health issues have also been examined by many investigators. Swedish psychiatrist Dr. Rylander investigated a sample of conscientious objectors imprisoned in Sweden. Of the 135 randomly selected cases, fully 126 were witnesses. Of these 126, Rylander diagnosed 51 as neurotic, 42 psychotic, 32 as mentally retarded, and 5 as brain damaged. Some overlap exists because some cases were in two or more categories. Diagnosis was solely on the basis of behavior that was clearly pathological, such as irrational paranoia or severe long-term depression, and not behavior that resulted from following Watchtower doctrine. As non-social involvement with the K, Rillander also concluded from the subject's records and his interviews that their pathological state was not uncommonly evident before conversion, but that the Watchtower's influence was often detrimental to mental health, sometimes severely so. About 4% of the eligible, armed service Swedish population were judged psychologically unfit for military services. The corresponding figure for witnesses was 21%, or a rate 5 times greater. This was very close to the same ratio found by Spencer, whose diagnosis of psychotic, or neurotic, was made on the basis of mental hospital admission screening. Few of the cases in Rillander's study were marginal witnesses, and most were actively involved in the Watchtower. Rillander concluded that many of those he studied lacked an education, job skills, emotional stability, and quality social relations. Unsatisfactory employment records often existed because of psychological deficiencies, lack of ability, or immaturity. Rillander found that witnesses committed, quote, a relatively large number of small crimes and other misdemeanors, which generally resulted only in a fine. 3 witnesses have been imprisoned for stealing or harboring of stolen property, and 36 have been fined for various offenses: traffic violations, drunkenness, unlawful selling of alcohol, poaching, unlawful entering, etc. End quote. He also concluded that individual witnesses tended to be burdened with a variety of serious concerns and often joined the sect in an effort to solve their many problems. Although the results of this study are not fully applicable to today's situation, many of his conclusions are still largely true. A major difference between his sample and today is that the witnesses are now more middle class and less socially rejected. Many witnesses, though, especially those living in developing nations, still experience many of the same problems that Rillander reported. Now let's look at the first American study. Pesser, in the first study on American witness mental health, diagnosed as psychotic over 7% of his total sample of young males imprisoned due to obeying the Watchtower's prohibition against complying with military regulations. The sample was obtained by interviewing all selective service violators admitted to the Federal Prison Medical Center during the study. The level of witness psychosis in his sample was about 17 times higher than that for the population as a whole. A whopping 7% were diagnosed psychotic, 4% had other mental abnormalities, and fully 1/4 were rated socially maladjusted. 16% of Pesser's sample were on hospital status, and 44% of these were diagnosed psychotic. The demographic characteristics of the witnesses in the study were as follows: almost half were raised on farms, and only 39% grew up in cities of 5,000 or more. About half had some high school education. The median grade achieved was 9.2, and the majority were engaged in agricultural work. The discrepancy between socioeconomic status and IQ was partly a result of the Watchtower's discouragement of occupational advancement coupled with their stress on the regular study of Watchtower publications, a practice which serves to develop verbal and reading skills. Only 2% were judged to have poor work performance, and over 40% took advantage of educational opportunities, mostly correspondence courses offered by the institution. Spanish was the most popular class pursued, presumably so the witness could serve as a Watchtower missionary when released. Now we move on to the Janner study. Swiss psychiatrist Janner, in 1963, examined a random sample of 100 Swiss citizens who were imprisoned because of objection to military service. About 85% were Jehovah's Witnesses. The study found showed a significant number of witnesses had one or more of the following symptoms: high level of fear, anxiety, severe neuroticism, introversion, and/or social isolation tendencies. Janner concluded that the witnesses were generally somewhat removed from reality, although some demonstrated intense religious feeling. End quote. As found in other studies, the majority of the witnesses in his sample were unskilled or semi-skilled workers. His research revealed a whopping 10.4% of the witnesses had previous criminal convictions, about of which were for sexual offences, mostly pedophilia and exhibitionism. The rest of the criminal connections were for minor property or personal offences. He did not compare the mental illness rate of Jehovah's Witnesses to the population as a whole, but concluded that the rate among witnesses was far higher than the rate among non-witnesses. The Watchtower influence was often not positive, and there was no evidence that it had in the long run helped those who had emotional problems when they joined. Evidence was found, though, that the Watchtower had an adverse effect on many regardless of their adjustment level when they became involved. Spencer, an Australian psychiatrist, examined the records of all admissions to Western Australia psychiatric hospitals from January 1971 to December 1973. He located 50 cases that, according to the patient's own admission, were active Jehovah's Witnesses. Spencer concluded that the rate of serious mental illness among this group was 3 times higher than that of non-witnesses, and the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was fully 4 times higher. A reason that Spencer's statistics are probably low is that witnesses are prone to avoid psychiatric treatment and, especially, institutionalization. The Watchtower, like many cultic movements, is very critical of both the mental health profession and most non-medical professional therapy. The official witness teaching is that the decision to visit a psychiatrist is up to one's conscience, but the undertone in most of their literature is strongly opposed to all types of professional mental health help. The typical witness believes that it is either very foolish or blatantly wrong to rely on the advice of a secular mental health therapist. Licensed therapist Montague monitored the admissions to state and private mental hospitals and local mental health clinics in Ohio from 1972 to 1986. From this data he estimated that the mental illness rate of JWs is approximately 10 to 16 times higher than the rate for the general, non-witness population. And that about 10% of the publishers in the average congregation are, quote, in serious need of professional help. Although they are often able to hide this fact quite well, especially from outsiders. End quote. From his intensive interviews with witness patients and others, Montague concluded that persons who had emotional problems were attracted to the witnesses. But Watchtower's involvement also caused many of the emotional problems that they suffered. This is evident from the fact that many with problems reported they were far happier after they left. Another study was completed by Potter as part of his PhD thesis on religion and mental health. He concluded that there exists, quote, a strong positive correlation between witness membership and clinical schizophrenia. End quote. In yet another PhD dissertation, Sack evaluated the effect of religion on the mental health of select clients. Although the case study method was utilized, many of the same conclusions were reached as found in the prior mentioned studies, and in many ways her research complements the present study. The clients she utilized had an enormous amount of insight into the pathological processes of the Watchtower and similar sects, and her study is well worth reading. In addition, a German study by Elmer Koppel also came to similar conclusions, as did a study by Norwegian psychologist Kjell Totland. Using Oakland County Court records from 1965 to 1973, Bergman concluded that not only is the mental illness rate above average, but the suicide and crime rates are also high, especially aggressive crimes against persons. This is the extent of published empirical studies about the mental health of Jehovah's Witnesses, an area in which a need exists for more research. The studies I mentioned may have underreported the level of witness mental illness because of sampling problems. A major flaw with the military research studies is that many seriously psychotic witnesses would have a history of hospitalization, and thus would likely have had a medical deferment. In the States, only those who have passed the required physical would be imprisoned because of refusing to obey the Selective Service Law. If these cases were included, the rate would be higher than that which both Pesser and Rylander found. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this as interesting as I did. If you or someone you know is suffering from depression, mental health problems, or having thoughts of suicide, please talk to someone now. Lifeline is available for everyone, it is free and confidential. If you're thinking about suicide, are worried about a friend or loved one, or would like emotional support, the Lifeline network is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week across the United States at 1-800-273-8255. Once again, thank you for watching.